Hi. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Well, people are joining. Let's take a few moments to just let everybody to join in on our session or today's session. Thank you so much for being here today. Can you see my slide? Well, okay. Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Laura Ibarra, an R2R, Road to Recovery's graduate fellow. And really, it is a big pleasure to welcome you to the Future Leaders in Conservation panel, Cultivating Emotional Balance, Conservationists, Global Challenges, and Ecological Grief. And well, before we get started, we'd love to know who is joining us today. Oh, me changed. So please feel free to introduce yourself on the chat and tell us, share your name with us and where you're joining us from. And we also want to let you know that we have simultaneous translation. Oh, sorry. We have today simultaneous translation. So Spanish is available for today's session. And if you want to access it, you just click on the interpretation icon that is at the bottom of your Zoom window, and you can select Spanish. And well, let's start. So to introduce today's conversation, sorry, I'm gonna change the slides. So how do we care for a changing planet while we are navigating this emotional weight of conservation work? Working in conservation can be incredibly meaningful, but it can also come with some emotional challenges, including ecological grief, climate anxiety, and uncertainty about the future. So today, we will explore these experiences and discuss ways to support our emotional well-being while continuing to work to protect biodiversity and ecosystems. And this conversation today is part of Future Leaders in Conservation initiative that is part of Road to Recovery. And this initiative seeks to engage and support students and people early in their conservation careers. This initiative focuses on building a peer support community, identifying ways of conservation organization can better support emerging professionals, and creating opportunities for learning, engagement, and networking. So we're very glad you're here, and we hope that this conversation gives you an opportunity to reflect, to connect, and to learn from one another. And I also want to take a moment to thank the Future Leader in Conservation Planning team. So this panel wouldn't be possible with their time, their ideas, and support. So thank you, Esmeralda Bravo, Eike Winnicki, Henry Stevens, and Kier Shawan. Thank you so much for all your work and to make this happen. So before we continue, let me walk you through what we can expect of today's session. First, we'll have a guided conversation with our panelists, moderated by SK, who is part of the Future Leaders in Conservation group. And unfortunately, one of our panelists, Karen McNally, who was scheduled to join us today, won't be able to be here with us due to illness. And this was an unexpected change. And of course, we wish Carter a speedy recovery and hope he's able to take the time he needs to rest and prioritize his health. So we're very grateful to Susan and Tamara for being here with us today, and we're looking forward for this conversation ahead. Following the panel conversation, we will have a Q&A session, so please feel free to share your questions into the chat through the session, and we'll address as many of them as possible during the Q&A session. And for the final 30 minutes of the session, we'll move into breakout rooms. And this will give you an opportunity to have a smaller group conversation with the panelists, as well as connect and reflect with other participants here today. And finally, we'll come back together in the main room for a brief closing and farewell. And with that, I'm very pleased to introduce our two panelists for today. Our first panelist is Susan Clayton, Whitmore Williams Professor of Psychology and Chair of Environmental Studies at the College of Worcester. Her research focuses on environmental and conservation psychology, including the psychological impacts of climate change. She has authored and edited several books on conservation psychology and environmental identity and has contributed to major American Psychological Association reports on climate change and psychology. Our second panelist is Tamara Hoffman, a clinical psychologist and PhD candidate in psychotherapy, specializing in eco-anxiety in Latin America. Her work focuses on understanding how ecological crises affect mental health and well-being, particularly among young people, and on developing psychosocial responses and coping strategies. She's also involved in research on eco-anxiety, extreme heat, and climate-related health impacts across Latin America. And our moderator for today's conversation is S.K. Winnicke, a postdoctoral researcher at The Ohio State University and a member of Road to Recovery's Future Leaders in Conservation initiative. SK works at the intersection of ecological research, community science, and conservation, and is currently helping to plan the third Ohio Bird Atlas. They are especially passionate about connecting science, conservation, and well-being. So thank you so much to our panelists and our moderator for being here today and for sharing your time and expertise with us. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, SK, to begin our conversation. Thanks.
Thank you. And thank you both, Susan and Tamara, for joining us today. So I'm going to ask some questions and I'll direct them to panelists, but have you both answer each one. So our first question will go first to Susan, but each of you comes to this conversation from a different vantage point. What first drew you to pay attention to the emotional side of conservation work? Susan, if you don't mind starting us off.
Sorry, yes. Okay. Yes, and before I start, just, it's a real pleasure to be with you today. I think this is a great event. I do have to admit that I'm also fighting off a virus, so if I say anything that makes no sense, that's my excuse, but I'm glad to be with you. And my background is as a research psychologist primarily, so I was very interested in understanding and observing people's reactions to the natural world before I started thinking about helping them manage those reactions. And especially, it was about almost 20 years ago that I started interacting with people who were working in the conservation field, especially people at zoos, and just listening to them talk about the loss of animals, sometimes individual animals, sometimes species that they had representatives of in their zoo or they were connected to in some way. And it just became clear to me that, that there were very strong emotions involved. And, that just made me very interested. And I wanted to understand more about those emotions and their role in helping people engage in conservation work, but also the kind of vulnerability that might result from those real unanticipated losses of biodiversity.
Thank you so much. Tamara?
Yes. Well, first of all, I'm also very grateful to be here. It's a true honor to be here in the company of Dr. Susan Clayton. I've only heard of you from, scientific journals and papers and books. I'm also a PhD candidate. I'm in my final year currently, and my paper is on ecological anxiety in Chilean youth. It's a qualitative study, but nationwide. And this is a study that, well, ultimately it had participants from all of Chile. And funny enough, Chile has 4,200 kilometers in length, right? From the desert of Atacama up in the north and the central area where you have more templated climate and the southern territory that is a lot colder with a lot of rain and the most Antarctic region of Chile. We have people from all over the place. And something interesting on this research, especially in Chilean youth, is that there's different weathers. There's different climates and there's different issues and different topics to address because of the different effects that we are observing as a consequence of climate change. Also, pollution and the loss of biodiversity is clear throughout the entire coast of Chile, or extent of the country. So, considering all of that, I have started a research paper that I think has become extremely complicated to do. You understand, here in Latin America, we have a gap of approximately 5 years in research. So most of the research in the world is done in the global north, and that has made it all the more complicated here. But it's still very relevant. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I am doing a psychotherapy PhD. But from the start, from my childhood, actually, I've been very close to nature. My father actually was a veterinary physician, and my mother was a forestry engineer. So I've always been very close to all things nature. And by studying psychology, in the end, I couldn't help but tying both worlds together. You know, the flora, the fauna, with the human soul. So research on ecological anxiety and different approaches of how to address those crises and the triple crisis that we're facing at the moment. And by triple crisis, I mean climate change, loss of biodiversity, and pollution, of course. So yeah.
Thank you both. Our next question is this: ecological grief doesn't always look the way that people expect. What emotions are people experiencing in response to environmental challenges? And we'll start with Tamara for this one.
Yes, and thank you for that question, because something that I was able to observe in my Chilean youth subject is that this eco grief, as we call it in English, and in Spanish we call it duelo ecological, it has many manifestations. Albrecht, an environmental scientist, says that it's sort of a series of psychosomatic symptoms. There's also climate anxiety, ecological anxiety, and ecological grief fall as separate things. So suppose we could refer to such a thing as ecological emotions. So starting with ecological anxiety in Chilean youth, I would have to say that it takes many forms and many different emotions. I would call them fluctuating emotional patterns. This is why the question is so interesting, because part of the findings that I've seen in Chilean youth is that you have all sorts of emotions. Sometimes it's melancholy, sadness, guilt, hopelessness, but you also have very high grade emotions such as anger, frustration, and also emotions that are a consequence of high alert, fear, anxiety, stress, and finally some breaking emotions such as some sensations of emptiness, and of course depression, or very close to depression. So, as a result of my research, is that it's a fluctuating character, and it is highly dependent on the individual experiences of the youth. When they first become exposed to these issues, first they typically feel anxiety and fear and concern of the future, and then a great concern of what is happening with institutions. Then comes the rage, the impotence, the frustration, because they understand that hardly anything is being done. Very often, it's outright nothing. And later, it evolves into melancholy, sadness, feelings of guilt, and in the end, it reaches a sense of emptiness. And it could also evolve into a cycle of dynamic emotional patterns that go back to the start, to the anger. There's also a Finnish researcher that is very interested in climate-originated emotions. And there's a great research on that. But in my particular paper, I've seen that the patterns are mostly fluctuating. They are not fixed, but somewhat predictable. It is also very complex to say today that the emotions that appear today still are not well understood from a scientific framework. We don't have this fixed emotion to start off. At least in my findings, the only thing that we can say about these emotions is they are fluctuating. And so, of course, work will have to be differentiated. It's going to have to make that distinction and perhaps identify it as parts of the cycles.
Thank you. Susan?
Yeah, and I want to start by returning to something that Tamara said about the majority of research being done in the global north. I'm sure people aren't surprised to hear that. So we really do need a lot more research from the global south, partly just for equity reasons, but certainly because people in those countries tend to be experiencing greater impacts of environmental degradation and climate change. So if we really want to understand the experience, we need to talk to them. And then, of course, there are cultural factors that can be really important to be aware of in terms of how we think of our relationship to the natural world. But getting back to this question, I think, again, I'll agree with what Tamara said. There are lots of emotions people experience. Some of the strongest are anxiety, also sadness, and even anger. I want to highlight that, we hear words like eco-anxiety and climate anxiety. Anxiety can be specific to a particular issue like climate change, or it can be more generally related to environmental problems. And that probably depends on the way people are conceptualizing the issue. I think one of the reasons we hear a lot of talk about anxiety is because a lot of people understand anxiety. We know what that experience is like. Anxiety disorders are a very, very common mental health problem, although I certainly want to stress that feeling eco-anxiety is not a mental health problem in and of itself. I would say it's a source of stress, and then it all depends on how you handle it. A couple of other emotions I want to call out are, again, anger. And I think that's really important, especially in people from the global south who are very aware that these problems are not primarily of their making. So it's not unusual to feel a little resentment that they are facing the consequences. And anger can be a very motivating emotion, so that's worth bearing in mind. Another emotion that really interests me is this sense of kind of betrayal or disgust or frustration based not just on the problem, but on the fact that people are not responding effectively. So we hear a lot of young people, for example, talking about feeling betrayed by governments whose responsibility it is to protect their citizens at some level, and clearly are not doing it in many cases, just resisting the evidence and denying the problem. The last emotion I'll mention is, again, getting back to sadness and grief, which happens because we recognize that something we value is threatened or is being lost. And grief is more profound than sadness. So sadness tends to be an emotional response. Grief kind of requires you to rethink your world a little bit. Things you took for granted, like, you'll be able to go back to this beach or this island where you grew up, or the trees will blossom at a particular time of year, or a particular species will return, and so on. And sometimes, due to environmental threats, those things don't happen anymore. So we kind of have to re-understand or reinterpret our world, and that's very challenging and difficult for people. And then my final comment about emotions is just that people can have positive and negative emotional reactions at the same time. So there certainly are very complex reactions that people have.
Thank you. Our next question is, what would you say to conservationists who are suffering from this sort of emotional burnout? We'll start with Susan again.
Yeah, I'm sure that probably everybody has heard this before in some way, but self-care is part of conservation care. I've heard people reference the airline statement, put on your own oxygen mask first. You can't do the conservation work if you have run out of energy and well-being on your own. And emotions take energy. It's not, I think people often misunderstand what is a psychological experience. They take energy, just like physical activity takes energy. So we need to have time to replenish when we've used that energy. I will say, telling ourselves that, the reason I'm feeling this pain is because I care, and that actually reflects well on you. I don't think any of us want to be uncaring about these issues, and we certainly shouldn't be. So recognizing, kind of pat yourself on the back for the fact that, yes, it is a hard thing. And then maybe just one more thing, that a lot of people who work in conservation are often very motivated. They have strong goals, and they want to do what they can to achieve those goals. But we need to work to our capacity and not to the need. In other words, if your capacity is overwhelmed and the need is still there, you need to stop, you need to recharge. Don't try to keep going. And that's the situation most of us will find ourselves in. Yeah, the problem is still there, but we have to allow ourselves to take a little break.
Thank you. Tamara?
So this is not an easy question. In fact, I've talked to a lot of friends who are environmental activists here in Latin America about this matter, especially in Chile. Because in this context, and at a political level, it is harder and harder to remain optimistic and to do self-care considering what is happening in our countries. There's some recent environmental decrees or statements have been published in Chile because of the current government. Some commitments were simply not made good on, and there were plenty of demonstrators who went out to the streets. In Chile today, it's extremely difficult to continue in that line of effort. And this is why encouragement is so important. Again, as Susan said, self-care is extremely important. But that is not to just neglect the broader political context. In Latin America, it is particularly difficult. So something that particularly helps me is to go back to Jane Goodall's quotes often, the primatologist, the famous primatologist, who proposes 4 reasons to keep your motivation. And that is what really brings me back home. From an intellectual perspective, of course, but also the ability for empathy. Those are 2 human qualities that can help us get us back. I mean, it is not only through reason and intellect that we can solve environmental issues. The capacity is there in spite of all the difficulties that we see today, and also the progress and of environmental issues. There's cases, for example, of a young person. I can't remember the name exactly, but there was this young man who incredibly was able to collect ridiculous amounts of plastic from the sea. There's also a Peruvian researcher, Mariana Punikova, who made incredible breakthroughs in decontamination technology. So there's cases of research and people, individuals who have made incredible changes. Second, always remember nature's incredible resilience. The world will be fine in spite of us. In World War II, there were plenty of nuclear tests done, and after Chernobyl, it seemed like the end of the world, but nature came back, and it came back stronger. The world will continue in spite of us, and long after we're gone. And finally, the power of the youth. The youth has incredible energy and incredible power. It has been one of the main driving forces of history. I believe in that strength, and I believe that change is possible. Ultimately, I would appeal to the human soul, to the human spirit. This goes beyond empathy because, again, I think empathy ultimately is a cognitive argument. In the search of meaning, for example, we can take the example of concentration camps of people who found meaning beyond their biological limitations. So I would appeal to the human spirit. Another great example is indigenous peoples in Latin America. They've connected that soul to nature. That is one of their central claims. And it is ultimately the same soul. I believe that both nature's spirit and our own can drive us forward and can make us make good on our promises.
Thank you. The next question is, what is one tool, resource, or practice that you found genuinely helpful for cultivating emotional balance? And we'll start with Tamara.
Well, personally, for me, I would say connection with nature, of course. In Valdivia, my hometown in southern Chile, we have the Valdivian jungle, the Valdivian forest. It's a beautiful forest with many native trees and moors, wetlands. I joined a trekking group, and we go to the mountain often, and that strengthens our connection with nature and has been so important for us. I've also followed some forest therapy courses, and I've found great connection with other people who are also suffering emotional distress situations mostly because of the political situation in our countries and others. the environment is being neglected in our current political context. And that is only making climate change that much worse. And it's not just in Latin America. I see that happening everywhere. That can take a severe emotional toll on people. So just going out and walking out in nature with people, with like-minded souls, like-minded peoples, and contemplating nature and strengthening that connection, I think, is an incredible resource and a practice that can greatly help emotional balance.
Thank you. Susan, same question?
Yes, I think I'll emphasize two things. One is to monitor your own emotions, because a lot of times we're not really aware of how we're feeling. We're not paying attention to it. So we might be responding in an overly angry way or overly sad way and almost not understanding our own response. And of course, that, although emotions are a really important predictor of action, if you're not aware of them, they might lead you to react in a way that's perhaps not as rational as you would like. So be aware of the kinds of emotions you're feeling. And also, when something feels overwhelming, try to monitor what led to that emotional response, so that you can pay more attention to what puts you essentially at emotional risk. And when you feel that happening, take a break. I think one of the things, again, that people interested in conservation often feel this weight of responsibility, that if I don't do something, nobody will do something. So it's kind of whether or not I take action is a reflection of whether or not will anybody take action. So they can be very reluctant to take a pause. But again, self-care is important. So take a break, engage in some de-stressing activities like going for a walk, talking to friends, mindful breathing, getting some exercise. All of those things can help. So monitoring and trying to manage your own emotions is the first thing I would recommend. And then the second one is to try to enhance connection. And this very much follows what Tamara was saying. Look for connection to other people. So other people who value the same things you do, who care about the same things you do. It's just so satisfying to know that you're not the only one, because sometimes it's very easy to say, and why is this upsetting to me and not to other people? Am I crazy? Am I misperceiving something? Am I totally out of sync with the rest of humanity? So finding people who agree with you can be very reassuring, and then having the chance to talk about your emotions definitely can help you manage them. Connecting with nature is another important part of connection. People who care about harm to the natural world are usually those people who care a lot about the natural world, who feel a strong connection to it. So we should allow ourselves to have the positive side of that connection as well as the negative side. Go out and just enjoy being there. And apparently this summer, the sort of meme of touch grass was going around. So that idea of just, it can be very helpful to literally ground yourself, feel that physical contact with the natural world. And then finally, I do fault the media a little bit for emphasizing the negative news. There is positive news, and it can help a lot to get a positive news story. So, sign up for emails that will give you some of that positive news, or look for it. And remember that even if, how can I say this without going into too much of a deep dive? Looking for meaning, it can be very satisfying to work on a cause you think is important, even if you're kind of pessimistic about the ultimate outcome of that work. We all want to make a difference. We like to feel that we are acting virtuously, and that sense that I'm doing something important matters a lot to people, and it can help to enhance your feeling of trust in yourself. And if you find other people doing the same thing, maybe enhance your feeling of trust in other people as well. Like, oh, I'm not the only person working on this. So renews your faith a little bit in society. I know that was more than one thing. I just remembered you asked for one, but that was multiple ones.
No, that's wonderful. Kind of along the same lines, beyond what we can do as individuals for ourselves, what can institutions or teams do differently to better support people carrying this emotional weight? And we'll start with you again, Susan.
Yeah, and I think this builds very much on some of what I just said, but what is the responsibility or the role of the institution? I think institutions could do more to acknowledge these emotions, especially if they are conservation focused institutions. Maybe have a weekly meeting where people can just drop in and talk about what they're experiencing, or if you're protecting a particular species and the signs are not looking good, give people a chance to just express their sadness, get some some emotional support for those emotions. So taking the time and space to let people describe and discuss their emotions, I think is important. We can also do a lot more to educate people about their emotions and how to regulate their own emotions. And Tamara talked about, I think, Pen Piccola's work on he's developed an emotion wheel. And I don't think he would claim that the emotion wheel covers all possible emotions, a climate emotion wheel. But it can be useful to people to say, oh, yeah, I hadn't thought about that emotion. That is one of the ones I'm feeling. So kind of providing people with more resources to help them identify their own emotions. And then, of course, there's a lot organizations can do to make resources available, mental health care, time off, educational resources, those kinds of things.
Thank you. Tamara?
So I am very much in agreement with what Susan said on what can be done. Number one, we start by validating the emotions, and giving it a regulation perspective is extremely important. Put a name on things, right? You mentioned the emotions wheel, right? What am I feeling right now? And why am I experiencing it in this way? That's so helpful. And we hope that institutions provide space for that, for people to work on their own emotions. And that could be through, yes, the research team meetings, for example, and address issues. So how is it that my work? What about what I'm researching is affecting me? How do I relate to that? And how does my team relate to it? But I specifically want to refer to educational institutions. That goes for universities and also schools, elementary schools. I also did a research project in teenagers in southern Chile. And it was not thought, I mean, people didn't think there that the teenagers would feel such anxiety, so many emotions about the climate change situation in Chile. And honestly, the research revealed that they were suffering in silence. Right after science class, many emotional issues would appear, and it could be tied pretty much directly to climate change and what they would observe right then and there. This was a rural school. I mean, they were children of artisanal fishermen. They were already seeing how the amount of fish that their parents could catch was decreasing every year. They would see more plastic on the beaches, and would also see the wildfires that are taking place in Chile. They would have great anxiety and fear that their homes one day would catch fire. So yes, that concern was also heavily linked to the territory. This is why ultimately I think that in the end we look not only about to future concerns. So that's typically what conservation is researching right now, but also to look at the people living on the territories. It is likely that an activist or a researcher is living close to a sector that is a zone that is vulnerable to wildfires, especially considering the context of heat waves today. So yes, being empathetic and offering institutional spaces to address the fear brought about by loss of biodiversity and climate change, and specifically in pollution, so that there's not just a cognitive approach, but also an emotional approach. How are you living through this experience? How is that affecting you and your loved ones? So, with these questions, I believe that this is how we build a foundation of empathy and awareness, not just of the environment, but of other people.
Thank you. And for our final question, in one sentence, what continues to give you hope or keeps you going in this work? And we'll start with Tamara.
Well, I'm not gonna lie. This is hard. This is not easy. And I would have to say that in the end, you would just have to look back at the fact that we must remain together and always consider that so long as there's people who love what they see and love what they do, there is hope for humanity.
Thank you. Susan?
Yes, well, I can answer that very easily, which is other people give me hope because I see people who care so much and are working so hard. And, how could I say, oh, no, it's never going to work. I'm going to give up in the face of those kinds of efforts. And also, not just other people's hard work, but of course, we sometimes have negative emotions. But when I get together with these meetings with other people, there's a lot of positive emotions expressed as well. So it reminds me of the value of what we're fighting for and the potential to actually do something to help.
Thank you. Now we're going to open up questions from the audience. So if you want to type your questions into the chat, then I will read them to our panelists. I have some questions already, but continue to keep those going. We have some time until we planned on doing breakout rooms. So the first question I have from the chat, you both mentioned that we should know how to act based on our capacity, understanding that there's this very broad need. How do we gauge where that limit is between our capacity and the need? I don't know if you want to raise your hand who wants to dive in on that or want me to call on you.
I guess I can start. I'll just say, monitor your own reactions, as I was saying a minute ago. If you're feeling overwhelmed, and especially, I think we know what it feels like to feel overwhelmed. And of course, everybody can feel overwhelmed at particular moments. But if you have this feeling of overwhelm that just lasts, then probably you're asking too much of yourself. That's what I would say.
I would just comment that we currently live in a system in which we're forced to give immediate answers, to respond immediately. We have a liquid tiredness-based society, right? And we just have to execute perfectly, always. But that's a capitalistic, anthropocentric model. Now we must perform no matter what and right now. So I would just like to propose that it is not necessarily true that we could just pause and look at nature. Nature isn't fast, isn't quick at all. It is not immediate at all. When you want something to grow, it takes time for the seed to blossom, to grow. Contemplation allows for broader context, for better understanding, and at that point, I can answer that question much better. What can I truly do? Take a piece of paper, take a pencil, and just organize thoughts. I think that can be extremely helpful when you feel overwhelmed by everything that's happening in the world. What can I do right now in this present, in the face of all these things? Just look back at nature. Again, nature is immensely wise. It works in cycles. The planet is also a cyclical entity. Answers are not immediate. Solutions aren't immediate. Sometimes they're not even apparent. Pausing and connecting is also a part of dealing with this disease. That is also something that is a critical problem. This undying sense of urgency. This is why pausing is so important.
Thank you. We did have a comment in the chat where folks are saying that they absolutely agree with this pace that, nature takes time. We need to also take time. A second question from the chat. If we engage with the public and potential donors as part of our role in conservation, how do we acknowledge the loss of species and biodiversity while also trying to keep feelings of hope in our audience who may be struggling with this ecological grief or anxiety?
Yeah, Tamara, do you want to start?
I'm sorry, I'm looking to the question in Spanish because it's right there. Thank you. All right, sorry, it was a bit of a lengthy question. I just wanted to. Maybe Susan, can you start off until I can gather my thoughts?
Um, Absolutely. Sorry, could you just summarize the question again?
Absolutely. So if we're engaging with the public and potential donors, how do we convey hope, while knowing that they may be struggling with grief and anxiety as well?
Absolutely. And I think the question partly contains part of the answer, which is that it's really important to give them a sense of hope because, of course, why bother donating to anything that you think is hopeless? You need to tell them a specific thing that can be done that will make a difference. But giving them a chance to talk about their emotions can be a useful thing too. I remember working with one conservation organization. I'm not sure if this ever developed into anything, but they were talking about having a website where people could write in about their own emotional experiences with eco-anxiety, and that could be an interesting to do. Or, especially if you have a smallish group of donors you're talking with, that would be easier to arrange.
Thank you. Tamara, do you have thoughts on this?
Yes, now that I've read the question, I would have to say that's also a complex question because, again, climate action is a priority. But to feel hopeful about it is extremely difficult because, again, the more you know and the more you research and the more you study about environmental issues at the moment, the less hopeful one feels. No question. But much as we said before, and I try to follow Jane Goodall's thoughts and insights. And look, when she died, I saw for the first time in my life an aurora borealis. Beautiful coincidence. And this is why I want to speak to that sense of meaning, of this sense of something transcendental above us. And I think this transcendence is an infinite source of energy to show people that change is possible. Again, hope dies last, right? And often, I mean, look, we see more and more geniuses, and they're younger every day, who achieve incredible things. I think we have to focus on those victories, albeit small, to find ways and to find donors, find reasons for donors to believe in this. And I think that a lot of it is just showing what already exists.
Thank you. Our next question from the chat, can you speak about the role of acceptance in this emotional journey? Susan, you're nodding. Do you want to go first?
Sure. I think, yeah, I guess at the very broad level, I would say we do have to be realistic, but with a bias towards being unrealistic. Oh, did I mute myself? No.
No, I can hear you still.
So we need to acknowledge, yes, species are going extinct, climate change is happening, it's getting warmer, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's not only okay, but good to be a little bit more optimistic than perhaps is strictly speaking justified, because that optimism is so important for people to motivate their action.
Thank you. Tamara, do you have thoughts on this?
Yes. So this is also a scientific discussion, acceptance towards resilience, right? In fact, the concept of resilience today is extremely criticized because it says, look, you should always adapt to what is happening in the world. Adapt to, all the ecological crisis. So acceptance is the first step to that, right? But from a clinical psychology perspective, and I do deal with acceptance a lot, honestly, I have to say acceptance is a process. It's not something that occurs on one day and it's sealed and it's done for. No, this is a process that one could have in along a journey. Number one, I have to be aware of what is happening. not deny it, no denial. Second, understand the rage, the anger, and then address the sadness. But that inevitably at some point will lead to action. And the importance of acceptance is to take all of those steps, but not just stay in any of them. Don't stay with the guilt, don't stay with the sadness, because hope in the end is the result of addressing all of that. If not, we would just remain paralysis. I mean, acceptance followed by paralysis is useless. Acceptance must lead to hope, because hope leads to action.
I like that a lot. Kind of along those same notes, are there resources for especially team leaders to host eco-grief conversations with their communities or teams? Like for instance, when they have a natural disaster in their region?
So, if I may, I'd like to start. So, in Chile, the resources are scarce, very scarce when it comes to these type of conversations, especially with ecological grief. In Latin America, there's no such thing as climate coffees or climate cafes, sorry. I understand those spaces do exist in the north, but from what I've gathered, for example, with environmental activists today, most people have to deal with this on their own and spontaneously. Only when they're overwhelmed, overstimulated with their own territory's issues, and they need these spaces to do that. And they have to do it absent resources. And leaders need them the most. They are often the most burned out because they are acting as containers for other people and their teams. So this is something that in Latin America, at least, are struggling. We're in dire straits for this and often it happens. There's a surge of hope with new administrations, and they do allocate resources for that, but the administration concludes, they are elected out, and the resources are lost. This is our loss. This is just a sad reality in South America.
Thank you. Susan, do you have thoughts on this question? You're muted, Susan, sorry.
Yep. Trying not to have people listening to me cough. I think that when we communicate with people, and you could extrapolate this to other kinds of issues as well, we need to do more than talk about loss avoided. We need to talk about positive possible outcomes. I think if the best we can hope for is to minimize damage, that's not very motivating. But people say, no, we can actually fundamentally change the way we relate to the natural world and the way we value the natural world. I think that can be very motivating. So I would just throw that in there as part of the message.
Thank you. I have another long question. Do you have recommendations for compartmentalizing these feelings? When working in conservation, it can be exhausting to live in this space all day long, then come home and continue to be anxious, angry, sad. It's hard to turn that off. Sometimes we need to sit in it for work. But what about trying to release that weight for a bit?
I'm happy to let Tamara start since that's kind of a clinical question.
Yes, I'm reading the question.
I'll just jump in quickly and say, yeah, I think part of our emotional response should involve a recognition of how our interactions with other people are being affected. And when you're close to people at some level, you rely on them to help you absorb these difficult emotions, but you should also not place too much of a burden on them. So thinking about that, you might think, oh, I'm really sad right now, or I'm really angry, and maybe I need to just go away and sit with this by myself for a little bit before yelling at my partner. So it's part of sort of emotional recognition.
Yes. Tamara, do you have thoughts?
Yes. Okay. So as a clinical psychologist, uh, look, I have to say, many patients come with this specific request. What can I do to not overburden my family with my concerns and my anger and my own baggage? What I could recommend, for starters, is that before going home, why not take a walk? Just walk around the block and try to look at the environment. Look at the setting. Look at nature. If there's no apple to walk around, perhaps find another space to connect with nature. For example, your pet, your cat, your dog, feeling their fur. This is also a connection with nature. This also connects us to our sense of nature. Again, contemplation is extremely helpful to come back down to earth to connect with the present. Something that I would also recommend is also mind social media. Again, sometimes just putting your phone on silence and not looking at social media is extremely useful. Perhaps just leave the phone on the side for a while, especially uh, before we go home or leave office problems at the office to disconnect from social media and mass media and have a moment of connection with the people who we love because sometimes we don't take the time to share with those we love. Sometimes our life energy or will to continue is I mean really comes from home, from understanding that this automated world and this dream that we're sold, right? And also considering that there's many terrible things happening in the world. Again, one must understand that there's great moments of meaning at home. So yes, connecting with nature within your home, and connecting with nature outside of your home also brings about greater understanding. We too are nature. Connecting with our sensations, with our breathing, with our own heartbeat, that's also an integral part of that. So I would just like to invite people to pause and try to remember society is relentless, all right? But again, this is ultimately a cognitive decision. Sometimes the answer is spiritual. And if spiritualism is not your thing, it's also a biological approach. Biologically speaking, a pause will help you regulate yourself. I would just make that pitch.
Thank you. Um, Again, all sort of related here. Do you have any advice on how you can break from this cycle of frustration and hopelessness without simply abandoning the cause? Feeling like you must leave the field of work for a job that you don't feel emotionally invested in because you're too frustrated and hopeless. Susan, you're nodding to this
Uh,
one.
Yes, I would say, take small steps. Identify small things you can do that make a difference. So you don't, because if we think every day I have to cure the biodiversity crisis, I have to cure climate change, that's kind of overwhelming. But I can I can try to recruit one more donor today. I could write or call a political official or a business leader to talk to them about this today. So help yourself to create that sense of effectiveness, uh, in small ways. And of course, as we've said already, don't think that all the weight rests on your own shoulders. Look at things that other people have done. That might also increase your sense of potential.
Tamara.
I fully agree with Susan. Make a to-do list, right? Immediate priorities, important priorities, and things that you still have time to do, right? That's a great approach for life, I'd say. Something that you can do today, for example, is just stick to recycling, right? Or start with a composting effort at home or something. Or even just picking up, you know, a piece of trash from your sidewalk. I mean, small actions add up, and it is something. It is active. It does matters. Realizing that small actions are extremely important in itself is a huge change. In fact, there's a beautiful story about a hummingbird. I don't know if you've heard about this, but the hummingbird would go to the forest. Would try to put out a wildfire by taking small drops from a nearby lake and drop it on the fire. And the jaguar would say, "Why are you doing this?" But all the animals saw the small hummingbird trying to put out this wildfire, and animals started joining, and it made a difference. A small action can lead to a huge change. You just don't know about it. Even if, just because you're alone doesn't mean that this is meaningless. It can generate change. That I think is important. It only has to work once. And in Latin America, we see so many obstacles in conservation. Remembering that small actions can lead to great changes is something extremely important.
Thank you. Next question, can you talk about why it's so much easier to focus or get sucked into the negative stories? The question asker says that they find themselves just wallowing in negative news and podcasts and stories. Tamara, you're really nodding there.
Yes. Well, so in psychology, we call it the cognitive bias of the negative cognitive bias, right? This is something that we have, and it's a biological evolutionary mechanism. We will focus on the negative naturally, much more than the positive, and that's just natural. Why does this happen? Well, because in antiquity, we would have to focus on the negatives just to make it to survive, right? If a small leaf moved and it was negative, we had to be focusing on that because there may be a predator behind that tree about to kill us. So in order to survive, we over focus on negative traits and negative emotions. But we need to understand that the current ecological crisis is understandable. It's an adaptational question. This is not something that we're imagining about the future. This is something that is present, it is having effects today, and so it is absolutely understandable that we feel so bad about it. So on one side, we have to start by validating what we're feeling, understanding the nature of negative emotion, but also understanding that sometimes we just need to let it happen. Let that pain come in. Let those negative emotions flow. And understand that nature is about balance. There's negative and good things. Nature isn't all that kind, There's earthquakes, there's wildfires. There's a lot of negative things to say about nature sometimes. So it doesn't make sense to deny it. It doesn't make sense to avoid it, but to feel them, to accept them, and ultimately to try and focus and understand the true value of the positive. And that is psychological work. It's about resignifying our experience, resignifying what we feel, and a constant search for hope. Again, it's not by avoiding negative emotions, it's by accepting them, but finding meaning and transcendence from them.
Thank you. Susan, do you have final comments on this?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that idea that it makes sense for us to focus on the negative, but I also want to essentially call out the media, which have a tendency to highlight negative news. So it's us, but it's also the system, and I think they could improve a lot in that direction by highlighting more positive stories.
Thank you. We still have questions in the chat, but we want to make sure we have time for our breakout rooms. So I'm going to pass this off to Laura to get us launched into breakout rooms.
Muchas gracias. Estamos otra vez en la sala principal. Eh, Espero que hayan tenido un tiempo para pues tener una muy buena conversación en cada una de las salas. En mi sala al menos sí hubo una conversación sumamente profunda. Tuvimos mucho tiempo para... Bueno, tuvimos algo de tiempo, para eso ojalá hubiéramos podido aprovechar más. Bueno, en el chat vamos a compartirles una encuesta para que por favor la llenen. Les agradecemos mucho si la pueden llenar. Y pues antes de cerrar, quisiera dar a nuestros panelistas, un minuto para que hagan un cierre. Comencemos con Susan, por favor. Gracias. Solo quiero repetir que agradezco mucho la oportunidad de hablar con ustedes y escuchar más sobre las emociones que están sintiendo. Y de nuevo, las emociones, bueno, supongo que mi cierre será que las emociones hay que reconocerlas, hay que tomarlas en cuenta. Ciertamente pueden afectar nuestra salud mental, pero también son fuertes, importantísimas de conexión y motivación para la acción y son la forma en la que podemos interpretar las condiciones ambientales en las que nos encontramos. Esperamos que dejemos de invalidar, pues que podamos poner atención y validar esas emociones. ¿Listo, Tamara? Well, I want to thank you all for the opportunity to be here. As you know, with someone who I admire deeply, Susan Clayton. And I would also like to thank everyone for your experiences, for sharing. And I would just like to invite you to go out in nature, to pause for a second and contemplate. Nature is relentless, it is so resilient. It invites us to look beyond and to find reason for hope. I would like to encourage you to find meaning, to overcome a problem that is also a humanitarian problem. It is a problem that affects us all. And nature also reminds us that when we connect with it, we can overcome. We can overcome this. So, yes, I'm very thankful for this experience. Muchas gracias, Tamara, por estar aquí con nosotros. Y finalmente, nuestra moderadora, Escape. ¿Tiene usted algún
I
cierre?
just want to thank you all. Thank you, especially
Pues
Tamara and
solo quiero
Susan, for all these
agradecerles,
good
especialmente a usted,
conversations.
Tamara y Susan, por las
I
maravillosas
feel less alone that
conversaciones.
we're all here and thinking
Y me
about
siento
this
menos
together.
sola, ciertamente.
And that's part of
Qué bueno que
our
estamos
goal of
todos
R2R at
aquí
the moment is
hablando,
to
conectando,
build
y
this
ese es
kind
parte
of
de nuestro
peer support
objetivo en
community.
Road to Recovery. Armar
So rather than
desarrollar
like
esta
a
comunidad para
mentorship model, this kind of
apoyarnos, ¿sí?
peer-to-peer
Una especie de,
connections.
sí, tutoría,
So
mentoría
do
y
make
tener
sure you
estas
fill out the
conexiones
survey
profundas.
that
Por
Laura
favor,
mentioned
completa la
so that
encuesta
we can
que les
build something that
mencioné,
would
de
actually
manera que
work for you
podamos
and be helpful,
construir
so
algo
that we
que pues
remember
ojalá
we
les sirva a
aren't
ustedes también.
going through all
Y
of this
recordemos
alone,
también
and we
que
can,
esto
use these
no lo estamos
connections to
haciendo
keep us
solos,
going.
que
Thank you
estas
all.
conexiones son importantes para seguir adelante. Gracias. Gracias y muchas gracias a todos los panelistas, a nuestros moderadores y a todos los que vinieron el día de hoy por contribuir a esta conversación. Quisiéramos sugerirles que sigan conectados y que continúen participando en Líderes Futuros en Conservación. Muchas gracias de nuevo por estar aquí y esperamos verles en eventos futuros. Tengan un excelente día. Gracias.